Welcome and take it away.
Thanks so much, Katarina. I'm coming to you from the beautiful Gatineau Hills, just north of Ottawa. And I wanted to start off on behalf of Sarah and myself, thanking Steve and your entire amazing organizing team for pulling this together. We're really happy to be here with you this afternoon. Sarah and I both wanted to acknowledge that we're both colonial settlers. Sarah was raised and is living on the unceded and surrendered territories of the Shishalt Nation. I was born and raised on Kahnawake, which is the Huron-Wendat, Abenaki, and Haudenosaunee, as well as Anishinaabeg territories. Sarah and I both completed our PhDs in Toronto on Huron-Wendat, Seneca, and Mississauga territories. And currently I am living and working on the unceded and unsurrendered territories of the Algonquin and Anishinaabeg nations. That land acknowledgement is not a token for us. It's actually core to the work that we're doing, particularly because our paper today is going to talk about movement of people who are incarcerated across Turtle Island. And so I want to tie this land acknowledgement directly to the fact that we are talking about the movement of humans involuntarily across a land that was originally involuntarily taken. And that the vast majority of these people represent people who have experienced state violence in many forms, including the ongoing legacy and activity of colonial violence that is unequally meted out, obviously, against Indigenous folks, as we recognize the overrepresentation of Indigenous, Métis, and Inuit people in the criminal justice system. So our work here today is done with intention of recognizing the wrongs done and reaffirming our commitment to the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, especially in respect to the calls to action around criminal justice. I'm going to turn it over to Sarah.
Great, thank you, Dawn. Hi, everybody. So the purpose of the paper we're presenting today is to consider how a recent insight in the theoretical work on carceral mobilities may help us frame experiences of mobility and immobility as described by our participants in the Prison Transparency Project 1.0, and also in relation to Canadian case law and reports by the OCI and others. By carceral mobilities, here we're referring to, in the words of Moran and colleagues, theorizations of mobility and power, and specifically the consideration of mobility as an expression of power in carceral settings. In particular, we're interested in how arguments around sedentarist carceralism, so a focus on fixity or immobility of incarceration, helps us to understand prisoners' lived experiences of restraint, especially as it intersects with coerced movement, such as the transport ban, as under-recognized forms of incarceration or carceral power. These intersections between stagnation and movement have also become deeply concerning in the context of COVID-19, in which both moving and sheltering in place have become crucial management strategies. Perhaps some of you have seen recent directives in Ontario that allows for the involuntary and non-consensual movements of hospital patients, and how these sorts of practices show us how carceral logics and logistics of moving people can be grafted onto other institutions. So to begin, I will say a bit about the framing literature and the methods and data before turning it over to Dawn to do the heavy lifting part of this, substantive part of the paper. So in terms of the framing literature, the recent scholarship on prisoner mobilities has critiqued conceptualizations of carceral spaces as fixed and stable, and movements within or around sites of confinement as linear and horizontal. Much of this scholarship is emerging from the field of carceral geography, but also intersecting with criminology and sociolegal studies, as well as prison studies in particular. So there's a lot of literature and it is growing. I just want to highlight some of the pieces that are informing the paper. So Moran and colleagues have drawn attention to the mobilities turn in relation to carceral spaces and the importance of considering coercion in relation to prisoner mobility, which they describe as coerced or disciplined mobility. And this is because it underscores the limited autonomy of those who are moved in penal settings. Drawing on Foucauldian framings of mobility as an instrument of power, they forward the concept of disciplined mobility as it offers a means of conceptualizing mobility with limited agency. Turner and Peters have highlighted and critiqued a sedentarist ontology in criminological studies of imprisonment through the failure to consider the complexity of prisoner mobilities in the lived experiences of the carceral. Gill and colleagues have developed the concept of carceral circuitry to theorize the connections between, around, and within and beyond carceral institutions. And they argue that it's important to consider the carceral, they argue that it's important to move away from considering the carceral from an institutional lens to think about how prisons are interconnected with other carceral spaces. Interesting work by Armstrong has looked at how mobility in prison needs to be considered, including understanding the prison as a technology of circulation as much as containment. And Armstrong argues that the dominance of the prison cell as visualizing imprisonment as a waiting experience defined by mobilization has worked to obscure the extent to which imprisonment involves constant circulation, porous borders, and unruly times. These are important aspects to the lived experience of incarceration. So Armstrong has juxtaposed the prison cell with the corridor to consider circulation within prison. A final example is a recent article by Brooks and Best that advocates for moving away from viewing prisons as isolated singular sites to what they refer as the mundane circuitry upon which the carceral state depends. And their empirical work, which I think is important on prisoner transfers, underscores the interconnectedness of various facets of the carceral state, which extend from border regimes to the penal system and beyond. So the literature on carceral mobilities is growing, including some really interesting empirical work, such as by our chair, Katharina Maier, which helps us see how the theoretical work aligns with lived experiences of the carceral at local levels in different jurisdictions. So in our paper, the aim is to take inspiration from the mobilities that characterize prison life, including transfers, as well as possibly shackling and chemical restraints. And one of the goals of the paper is to think about how theorizations of mobility can inform and shape an abolitionist argument. Just very briefly, the methods data upon which this paper is based first draws on the first iteration of the Prison Transparency Project, or PTP, and what we call fondly PTP 1.0. And this was a multi-year study across 4 research sites in Canada that examined the experiences of incarceration among former prisoners. And this was funded by a SHIRC Partnership Development Grant led by Dawn, along with an academic team of Gillian Balfour, initially Kelly Hannah Moffat, but then Kelly Struthers Montford, Joanne Martel, Deborah Parks, and myself. And we also had a fantastic team of research assistants, including some with lived experiences of incarceration. I know I'm running out of time for my portion. As a shameless plug, Dawn and I are also among a great team of collaborators working on PTP 2.0, which focuses on carceral transparency across 3 sites, Canada, Spain, and Argentina. And on May 19th to 20th, we have an international conference looking at prison transparency and COVID-19, which is free, and you're all welcome to attend, and perhaps I can share the link in the chat function. So the PTP 1.0 involved qualitative interview data across the research sites. And the paper today also looks at Canadian case law on prisoner transport, along with OCI reports and other grey literature to document the experiences of being transported. So I will now hand things over to Dawn.
Thanks, Sarah. Can you go to the next slide, please? Perfect. So this is the focus of, or at least part of the focus. Sorry, Sarah, can you go back to the photograph for a second? and then we'll come to this one. So these vans, many of you, I'm sure, have seen them along the highway, going in and out of courthouses, leaving prisons. This is the Correctional Service of Canada, so the federal prison service version of the van, but the vans are basically the same no matter what jurisdiction you're in. And they are the focus of our paper today because they are largely unrecognized sites of confinement, despite the fact that so many of the people that we spoke with talked about the amount of time that they spent in these vans. To the extent that they actually have a name for that time. So depending on the part of Canada that you're in, that name changes. In some areas of the country, they'll talk about it as a milk run. Most of our participants talked about these as ghost trains. And I actually think that that label is quite an apt one, because truly the folks who inhabit these spaces are completely forgotten by the state, by transport safety authorities. It's as if the time that they spend in here, they're not actually existing as human beings. They're not recognized as prisoners. They're not recognized as people who have rights, even rights to basic safety and security, as you would see under the Motor Vehicles Act. You can see that just by looking at the inside of the van itself. And this is actually an image that we took from the Correctional Investigators report on these vans from 2017. So basically what we're looking at is your typical Dodge Caravan family van that's been retrofitted. So all the seats have been taken out. Inside you see either a fiberglass or a steel bench on either side. You'll note that there's no cushioning, there's no ventilation, there's no heating, and there are no safety restraints. Which means that when we went to review the case law, there were, at least in the last couple of years, at least 9 cases that involved direct litigation regarding injuries that prisoners had experienced while being in these vans, or medical crises that they had experienced as a result of the conditions in these vans. But in every single one of those cases, the prisoner's appeal for redress or compensation was denied by the courts. Because again, the courts hold the line that these are not in fact prisons, that they are to be governed exceptionally and differently somehow. And that the basic expectations for safe, secure, and humane confinement, as is the mantra of Correctional Service of Canada, does not apply when people are in these vans. So effectively, we want to argue then that these vans constitute a black box of the prison experience that assumes that the prison experience is a wholly sedentary experience. And what we've found is that it is in fact not that at all, that in fact the prison experience is very much one of mobilities. Most of you will be familiar with the case of Ashley Smith and the 19 transfers. Her case alone shows how important and crucial mobilities are to the carceral landscape in Canada. We also need to remember that the first prisons were vehicles. So movement is inherent in the history of the prison itself, right? They were never fixed sites to begin with. We think here specifically of slave ships and prison ships. There are still prisons today that are vehicles, including the recently decommissioned Rikers Island. But mostly underlying this, what we want to pull out is the impact of this involuntary movement as it's key to carceral logics and how we now see it grafting onto, as Sarah said, other ways of attempting to control populations, and in particular, this recent move in Ontario to allow for involuntary transfers of hospital patients. So coming back to the prisoner transport vans, they've been described in many different cases, as well as by our participants. The experience in general is one that is characterized as being entirely unrecognized. So it's like in this extra legal space, that it's involuntary and it is endless. So people can spend up to 2 to 3 days in transport on these vans without necessarily even having a chance to stop and go to the washroom or exit the van or get food. As a result, people describe the time spent in transport as terrorizing and torturous forms of movement. They point to the fact that there are absolutely no guidelines despite repeated accidents, including fatal accidents. There are no guidelines on prisoner transports, which shows that the prison services themselves, both at the federal and provincial levels, don't even consider these vans to be carceral spaces. Because they're not considered carceral spaces, the justification for that is that it assumes that people are going to only be on these vans for a few minutes, right? Just as they're being taken from the prison to the hospital or the prison to the courthouse, but that we know that that is not true. So we have documented reports, 8 hours, 16 hours, 36 hours, people spending on these vans being moved from spot to spot to spot, right? So there is a very transient and indefinite nature to the lived experience of being held in this place alongside the sensory deprivation. Because remember, you can't see anything, there's no windows, you can't hear where you're going, and you can't, you have no ventilation. So you don't even have a way of sensing, like, has the temperature outside changed or the weather outside changed? There's absolutely no sense of what's going on outside of being in that steel box. So the correctional investigator, Ivan Zinger himself, went and took a ride in one of these vans. He described his own experience as being brutal and claustrophobic. He talked about them as horror boxes, that they were dehumanizing and inhumane, unsafe, disorienting, and an experience of complete sensory deprivation. You can see a lot of that here in this excerpt from the OCI report, noting importantly here that he himself recognizes that the potential for critical injury and death is high. Can we go to the next slide, please, Sarah? So I just want to give you one, we have a lot of examples here, but the case that I want to give you that I think really illustrates what we're talking about or what we're concerned with is the case of Edwin Nott. So Edwin Nott's case is still working its way through the courts. As you can see, the suit was only filed in January 2019, and because of COVID court delays, it hasn't gone further than that. Mr. Nott is was at the time of the incident a 65-year-old made seaman. He had a documented heart condition. In his statement of claim, he describes 8 hours in one of these transport vans as an experience of spending 8 hours in a barbaric cage. His walker was placed in that same space. So you can imagine if there was a collision or a rollover, that not only would Mr. Nott have been flying around in the back of the van, but he also would have been flying around with his walker, which was also not secured. That 8 hours was a transfer from Bath Correctional Institute to the Kingston Courthouse, which is, in the worst case scenario, a 34-minute trip. So why does it take 8 hours? Well, what we heard again and again from our participants is that guards will purposely stop along the way. They like to stop and get a fresh cup of coffee and make sure that they open the slide between the cab and the back of the van so the prisoner can smell the food, even if they can't actually get access to it, because certainly no food is ever passed back to the prisoners during these transports. We got reports from people talking about being parked. They didn't know where, they assumed in a parking lot, but of course they couldn't see out. Being parked for long periods of time and vaguely being able to hear the correctional officers who are transporting them laughing and joking outside the van. So it is very common for trips that are supposed to only be a half hour or less to take many, many, many hours, if not an entire day, based on seemingly purposeful delays. As a result, Mr. Nott himself went into a medical crisis because of the extent of time that he spent in this van. He was denied medication, food, so his blood sugar dropped. He couldn't go to the washroom. He experienced dehydration. He also had a prostate issue. So the inability to use the washroom was a very serious concern. And in his statement of claim, he claims distress, embarrassment, and humiliation. But as you can see, Sarah, if you want to just move forward. He's not alone in this experience. So here we have John, who was a participant from the Greater Toronto area, again, talking about the ghost trains and being moved from Toronto to Sudbury and back again. Sarah,
We're
could
at
you move it
time,
forward?
unfortunately.
Oh, we're at time. Okay, so I'll just wrap it up quickly. Thank you. So essentially, I mean, in part of the broader papers, we want to show that the movable prison is a form of incarceration that amplifies the pains of imprisonment in ways that we're only beginning to document and understand. And the link that I want to make here to the hospital transfers is that we see this public hue and cry about people being moved involuntarily without the consent of themselves or their families in the middle of a COVID crisis, because that sense of having your family member dislocated or yourself being dislocated without being able to consent to it is seen in the healthcare crisis as a major human rights concern. So I think this offers us an interesting opportunity to think quite critically about, okay, well, why is there then this hue and cry when people are involuntarily moved in the context of a hospital transfer, but we don't even recognize that involuntary movement in the context of a prison transfer is an exacerbated and, in fact, torturous form of incarceration. And I will leave it there. Thank you very much. We'll be happy to take your questions.
Thank you so much, Sarah and Dawn, for this engaging presentation and for showing us that movement is an embodied experience that is not always associated with freedom, but that can induce tremendous pain and suffering. So thank you for that. Next up, we have Sophie Lachapelle, Katharina Bogosavljevic, and Jennifer Kilty, all from the University of Ottawa. And they will talk about the cruel optimism of public health, effect theory, and the role of public health in the creation of carceral spaces. Welcome all.
Thank you, fellow Katarina. Just for, I guess, simplicity, you can call me Kat throughout. Just so we're not doubling up. So I'm a PhD candidate in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa.
Hey everyone, my name is Sophie. I'm a research assistant in the Department of Criminology at the University of Ottawa. And yeah, thanks for coming to listen to us talk about our paper. So before we get started, as residents of Vancouver and Kingston and students in Ottawa, we do need to acknowledge that we are living and learning on stolen lands. So Vancouver is located on the unceded territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh First Nations. Cataraqui Kingston, Ontario is situated on the traditional territories of the Anishinaabe and Haudenosaunee nations, and Ottawa, Ontario is situated on the unceded and unsurrendered Anishinaabeg territory of the Algonquin people.
So just quickly, an overview of our argument and sort of what we hope to do with the paper is to consider how public health deploys the language of risk to justify the carceral management of and indeterminate intervention upon citizens. So to do this, we explore the affective economies of risk in public health discourses as a way to control spatial presence and movement, noting how this can disproportionately affect marginalized communities. We aim to show how the carcerality of public health, which includes not only its discourses and the spaces it creates, but public health as an institution as well. And so to do this, we mobilize examples of strategies invoked to manage unhoused people during the COVID-19 pandemic in 2 Canadian cities. So Vancouver, which is located in British Columbia, and Kingston, which is located in Ontario. And we note in particular how public health uses the affective language of risk to carceral ends.
So just transitioning right into our literature review. So the discipline of public health is generally considered to advance a public good. The language of equity, social justice, and empowerment is so integral to the mission of public health that many of its practitioners have positioned public health and prison as theoretically antithetical to one another. But it's also well known that carceral methods like quarantine and isolation have been used to control disease outbreaks. However, prevailing historical accounts of public health often stop short of the ways in which public health was developed and subsequently deployed against Indigenous communities in service of colonial ends. For example, Warwick Anderson argues that public health was a discourse of settlement as much as it was about disease. And based on racist notions of purity, public health ideals of hygiene and cleanliness were not founded in objective scientific evidence, but rather they were constructed in such a way that always already positioned Indigenous, Black, and other communities of color as permanent subjects of public health intervention. And with the rise of neoliberalism, the purview of public health expanded its primary discourse from that of personal hygiene to risk management. And so in our paper, we argue that risk, similar to past public health ideals of hygiene and cleanliness, has become the state's preeminent conceptual instrument for expressing its own colonial affect, justifying carceral interventions while obscuring the structural and ideological consequences of doing so.
So what is affect? Cedric defines affect as, this kind of free radical that attaches itself and permanently intensifies or alters the meaning of almost anything that it touches. So affects are therefore productive in the sense that they do things. So they transform the objects of our feeling and they attach certain moral judgments to those objects. And so Ahmed refers to the productive effect of emotions as an affective economy, where emotions circulate in the world, sticking and attaching themselves in varying degrees to different objects, people, places, events, could be behaviors. And some people or places or objects get saturated with more affect than others. And so it's in this way that affects mediate the relationship between the individual and the social. And risk plays an important role within this affective economy. So we actually conceptualize risk as an affective term that circulates and attaches itself to objects, people, and events. Lupton calls the interplay between these concepts as a emotion risk assemblage, in which both emotion and risk interact and co-construct each other. So for example, risky subjects are turned into objects of fear, and thus are people to be feared. And so this affective positioning justifies the increased surveillance and management of those who are constructed as risky. So next we're going to talk about just provide a really quick overview of 10 cities in both Vancouver and Kingston. We're not going to do it justice in this presentation, so bear with me. The housing crisis in Vancouver, and more specifically in the downtown east side, is, among other things, the result of years of colonial dispossession, neo-capitalist housing policies, gentrification, the opioid crisis. The downtown east side is actually located in one of the most expensive parts of Vancouver, yet it has been dubbed Canada's poorest postal code. And it's often been the site of continued resettlement, erasure, and development, and it's left many people without safe, permanent, and affordable housing. So the encampment at Oppenheimer Park first opened in 2014, but was then quickly closed down, and people living in the tent city were resettled into temporary housing offered by the British Columbia government. The city was cited, the closure of the city, or justifications for closing the city included, closing the tent city, were sort of worsening weather, deteriorating living conditions, and incidents involving weapons as justifications for the first injunction to close the park. So the camp then opened again in 2018 and grew to about 120 tents. So now we spring forward to the early days of the COVID-19 pandemic. The Ministry of Social Development and Poverty Reduction and the Ministry of Mental Health and Addiction in BC announced a public safety order on April 25th, 2020 to shut down Oppenheimer Park because of fears of COVID-19 spreading through the community. The camp was finally shut down and a blue fence was erected not only to keep people from camping in the park, but from using the park altogether. And so folks who were living in the encampment in Oppenheimer Park then moved to Strathcona Park in June of 2020. The camp at Strathcona Park grew to approximately 400 tents by mid-2021, And after repeated attempts to shrink the camp, and as a result of pressures from property owning residents in Strathcona, the Vancouver Park Board finally ordered that no more tents were to be erected after April 30th, and that the city must find some form of temporary affordable housing for its residents.
All right, so Kingston, like many other mid-sized cities in Ontario, has long experienced a housing crisis, one that worsens with each passing year. But there are a couple of things that make Kingston unique. Notably, Kingston is the prison capital of Canada, hosting 7 federal penitentiaries across the city and 20% of all federally incarcerated people in Canada. In 2018, 16% of unhoused people in Kingston reported that they had been incarcerated in the past 12 months, and 8% disclosed that their criminal record was a barrier to finding permanent housing. But it's not only formerly incarcerated people that struggle to find housing in Kingston. The city of Kingston has reported a citywide shortage of 3,900 affordable housing units, with an additional 7,000 households experiencing a core housing need. And so in March 2020, when the COVID-19 pandemic was declared, the city of Kingston quickly set up 2 physical distancing shelters. However, unhoused people quickly began to critique these shelters for their increased surveillance measures, lack of privacy, and intense isolation, deciding instead to form a tent encampment behind City Hall. But the city swiftly removed the encampment and instead instructed unhoused people to camp at Bell Park, a public park approximately 2 kilometers away from the downtown core. And the size and scale of this encampment in Bell Park quickly grew beyond anything previously seen in the city. The encampment, which grew to more than 40 unhoused people, remained in Bell Park for 5 months before its residents were violently evicted by the city and Kingston police on September 1st, 2020.
So now to sort of get into the meat and bones of our paper to talk about public health as carceral management. So homelessness is inseparable from the institutions of private property and citizenship. And in comparison to propertied citizens, unhoused people are understood as risky, almost but not really citizens, in need of disciplinary action to remedy their non-normative lifestyles. By this logic, tent cities are illegitimate because they appropriate public space. Public health discourses of risk and responsibility are often cited as justifications for disciplinary interventions upon unhoused people, as homelessness presents both medical and epistemological concerns to the historically colonial discipline of public health. Not only does homelessness pose physical and mental health consequences for those who experience it, but their placelessness, according to Bashford, creates anxiety in a public health system that relies on spatial tracking. It is this sense of placelessness that often results in emotionally charged disavowals of unhoused people from propertied citizens, who view the former as dangerous trespassers or strangers from elsewhere who pose particular public health risks to the wider community. So for example, propertied citizens in Strathcona Park, and particularly those involved in the neighborhood's very vocal Strathcona Residents Association, often invoke the public health risks associated with homelessness when speaking out against the encampment. For instance, Katie Lewis, who is the vice president of the Strathcona Residents Association, explains, people in the neighborhood want the city shut down. People in the neighborhood want the city to shut down the encampment for safety reasons. The health of those who are living at the park is also at risk. There are very few hand washing facilities. There are 2 showers, I think, for the whole camp, and there are very few toilets. So it's not only a public safety issue here, this is a real public health crisis as well. And so although the Strathcona Residents Association identifies the need for more equitable housing resources for unhoused people, this veneer of compassion quickly dissolves when examining the affective language such requests levy against unhoused people. Invoking feelings of fear and disgust towards people living in the encampment, Lewis once again claims to speak for the Strathcona community when she says, in the 2 months since the camp went up, I dutifully filled a spreadsheet of all the things that are reported to the Residents Association. Residents threatened with knives, crowbars, and even guns. 2 kidnapped dogs. Needles are a constant concern. So public health plays an important role in the rationalization of the feelings of property citizens. And with the COVID-19 pandemic, in addition to narratives of violence and criminality, are continuously used to suggest the dangerousness of the encampment in Strathcona Park, even while people living in the park determinedly express their right to self-determination and autonomy in where they feel most comfortable living.
So now we'll move on to talking about banishment as public health practice. So in a settler colonial state, homelessness must be spatially disciplined in order to control the aberrant placelessness of unhoused people. Using the practice of banishment, authorities try to compel unhoused people to quit public spaces. And it is important to note, like our previous presenters, that carcerality is not necessarily fixed to our particular geographic location. The banishment of unhoused people is in fact carceral. And the ability to control our own movements is intimately wrapped up in ideas of private property and citizenship. But banishment is also an affective practice. For Brett's story, quote, "Banishment spaces demonstrate to a wider community that danger is nearby, that it is predominantly Black or Brown, poor and working class, and those labeled as dangerous who are socially disposable," unquote. Rather than primarily addressing the health and well-being of unhoused people, the practice of banishment is meant to improve the quality of life of propertied citizens, even if only through the reinforcement of the affective discourses of colonialism and private property. And so thinking back to public health as a mechanism of spatial governance, we can begin to understand how public health risk discourses used to expel unhoused people from public spaces are in fact carceral. For example, in Kingston, over the tent city's 5-month tenure in Bell Park, city officials reimagined public health risk multiple times in order to compel unhoused people to quit public space. Each time unhoused people adhered to or resisted these risk management narratives, local authorities would return with a new reason why the encampment was risky. So first, when unhoused people began camping behind City Hall in mid-April, it was unhoused people themselves who were quickly identified as a high-risk population for contracting COVID-19, and they were moved to Bell Park to better physically distance. However, when they moved to Bell Park, the local public health unit problematized the tent city as a risky place to live, and unhoused people complied with public health guidelines, cleaned up the area, and actually further physically distanced themselves to the satisfaction of public health. However, when the risky tent city remained, the city once again came back with another reimagining of risk and began to remove essential services from Bell Park, like electricity, running water, and garbage collection. And they also problematized the very ground on which the camp was situated, a former landfill, as risky. And this approach to evict campers was successful, and campers were evicted on September 2020. So what have we learned? Well, in both cities, repeated attempts to banish unhoused people via discourses of public health contributes to the carceral management of marginalized communities. And no matter the form or object of risk, city officials in both provinces demonstrated an unwavering desire to banish unhoused people from public spaces and relocate them to more suitable surveillance spaces of care. Even while administering care in the form of basic survival needs, public health interventions worked to conceal and contain homelessness, effectively managing poverty in and through carceral spaces rather than working to eliminate it. Ultimately, we argue that public health risks play an important affective role in the ways that marginalized communities are managed in our society, revealing the palpable yet slippery distinctions between care and carcerality, especially in a pandemic. Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you so much, all three, for your timely research. And there were a lot of interesting connections to the first paper, so I hope we can explore some of those in the Q&A. Next up, we have Sarah Runyon from the University of Arizona. I don't see Sarah on my screen, but I do know that we have 2 or 3 Kelly Gorkoffs as panelists, so maybe one of the Kelly Gorkoffs is actually Sarah. So I'll just pause and see if Sarah is on. No, doesn't look like it. So let's move on to the next two presenters, if you're ready. So next up we have Jantje van der Weetering and Michael Weinrath, both from the University of Winnipeg. And they will be talking to us about painting a picture and creating knowledge, exploring the influence of crime representation in research examining perceptions of crime. Welcome, Jantje and Michael.
Thank you, Katarina. I will see if this is going to work now. All right, that should be visible. So before I begin this presentation, I want to just acknowledge that this is part of my MA thesis, and I'd like to mention Dr. Michael Weinrath. He was my supervisor, and he's been very helpful in the process of doing this research. And I also should mention my committee members, Dr. Stephen Combe and Dr. Wendy Josephson, who also had some input into this. So before I get into the paper, I would like to begin by asking you all to imagine a criminal act. So let's take, for example, theft. I'd like you to think about how morally wrong such an act would be and how much harm would result from such an act. If we think about crime from a social constructionist stance, then we can say how we define crime and the difference between crimes is the result of the social values and customs to which we have been exposed. Our perceptions of crime and how we judge how serious, wrong, and harmful we judge an offense to be are informed by our knowledge of crime. This knowledge is formed through the social representations of crime we encounter. When we talk about perceptions of crime, it is important to consider the representations of crime, since these representations influence our perceptions of crime severity. In other words, understanding how we come to know about crime is important because it not only tells us what we know, but also what we may not know about crime. For example, the media is one source of knowledge about crime. However, research has shown that crimes of violence are featured disproportionately in the media compared to their incidence in official statistics. And also, media portrayal of crimes, as we all know, is often brief, with very few details or explanations about underlying causes. Another source of knowledge about crime could be post-secondary education. For example, a criminal justice degree, a sociology degree. So knowledge of crime obtained through academic education is less biased and more objective, however, perhaps not necessarily inclusive. So research by McGurran and colleagues has shown a significant underrepresentation of corporate and white-collar crime and criminology in criminal justice journals, as well as undergrad criminal justice textbooks and doctoral programs. These are just two examples of how we obtain knowledge about crime that guides our perceptions. However, if representations are so important in forming public perceptions outside of academic research, would it not be especially important to consider how we represent crime when doing research? Does it really matter how we depict crime when we're doing research? So when trying to measure public perceptions or reactions to crime, the popular approach has been to ask participants to consider a certain crime type and provide a rating of the perceived severity. Some studies have employed one-line descriptions where participants are simply asked to provide a rating for a certain type of crime based on a generic description. So for example, rate the severity of break and enter. For other studies have used more detailed crime scenarios that provide participants with more context, and some have even gone so far as to use actual court cases to provide a scenario. Both approaches have benefits as well as drawbacks. So crime scenarios capture the complexities of crime and are potentially more stimulating for the participants. They also provide some sense of standardization in relation to details such as the nature of the harm, the victim, the offender. However, at the same time, scenarios might suffer from researcher bias. After all, there's only one story you can present, and as a researcher, you are the one that's picking that story. There's also an issue with the generalizability of the findings. So does the break and enter scenario that I created actually provide a fair representation of break and enter? And then there's also the problem with introducing confounding variables. So perhaps participants were influenced by the fact that the victim in the scenario was a child, or because the offender had certain characteristics. So we could, of course, avoid the problem of confounding variables and just use more generic crime descriptions. Just don't mention any characteristics, just make participants rate the severity of break and enter. The use of such generic descriptions might also mean that our results might be more generalizable to those obtained compared to those obtained from very specific crime scenarios. However, one-liners have drawbacks, especially when it comes to within-group variability. So when I asked you in the beginning of the presentation to consider a theft, you will have formed a mental image of a theft based on your unique knowledge or experience with theft. Known as fill-in-the-blank behavior, participants subjected to generic descriptions will make assumptions about variables surrounding the crime based on their experience and knowledge. Just like the blind man trying to describe an elephant, each person has its own experience where he or she is basing her perceptions on. And that type of variability between participants is very hard to control. Nevertheless, despite these pros and cons, little consideration has been given to the possible impact of these differing designs on severity ratings. So in my research, I wanted to examine the impact of crime representation in survey research. Specifically, I wanted to know whether the representation of crime in survey research significantly impacted participant responses to perceived levels of seriousness, wrongfulness, and harmfulness. In other words, does it really matter what type of representation we use? So to conduct this study, we recruited a sample of 971 students from the University of Winnipeg. The sample consisted primarily of undergrad students from various disciplines and at various stages of post-secondary education, so ranging from first-year students to students that were graduating from the 4th or 5th year of university. I won't go into detail about demographics, but I do want to note that in comparison with the university statistics, the sample, even though it was not randomly selected, was quite representative of the general university population. So participants were asked to complete an online survey. They were provided with 4 short crime descriptions, as well as 4 crime scenarios reflecting similar crimes, and asked to rate their perceived levels of seriousness, wrongfulness, and harmfulness on a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being most serious and 1 being not serious. So seriousness is a bit of an abstract concept, and to kind of tackle this, we introduced moral wrongfulness and harmfulness as ways to conceptualize crime seriousness. The crimes we picked consisted of fraud, hate crime, assault, and break and enter, and the order in which we presented the crimes was rotated in order to avoid order effects. And also to minimize researcher bias, in the creation of scenarios, and to allow for a more factual representation of crime, we based the scenarios on actual court case descriptions. So in terms of analysis, we used pair sample t-tests to examine the difference between the mean severity ratings for one-liners and scenarios. And then to follow up and tease out the reason for any differences in ratings, we also conducted a linear regression analysis to determine the influence of wrongfulness and perceived harmfulness as predictors on the construct of seriousness. And these are some of the results. I haven't included the results for all crimes because the table gets really hard to read at that point. But our t-test results, which you see here in part, showed that the mean severity ratings for scenarios were significantly higher than the ratings for the one-line crime descriptions, with the largest differences showing for ratings of perceived harm. So a couple interesting things to note here. When we looked at the results from the linear regression analysis, which I don't have right displayed right here, both wrongfulness and harmfulness proved to be very strong predictors of seriousness ratings, and from the two, perceived harm was the stronger predictor. So considering the influence of harmfulness on levels of seriousness, it's very possible that the higher ratings for harmfulness also increase the other severity ratings. So higher levels of perceived harmfulness result in an increase in overall perceived seriousness. And I do want to note that crime type made a difference here too. So crimes that were more ambiguous, such as fraud, not as well known, also saw a bigger difference in between the one-line descriptions and scenarios, and especially also in terms of perceived level of harm. And then also, when we look at the variability between severity ratings, you can see that there is a decrease in variability ratings, in the variability of severity ratings in the scenarios. Again, this might be due to the fact that we have a reduced ambiguity about the potential harmfulness of the offense, since scenarios provide a clear picture of the potential harm that a particular criminal act might cause, so there's no guesswork about how harmful it might be. There's a clear, distinct example of what harm could potentially occur. Decreased variability for severity ratings in scenarios compared to one-liners might also suggest that the likelihood of fill-in-the-blank behavior with the one-line descriptions is very well possible. So, what does that mean to us? Well, the way we represent crime in academic research appears to have a significant impact on the results we obtain. In other words, the representations of crime in research influence the creation of knowledge, something I think we should consider when conducting research on social reactions to crime. Considering the importance of crime representation, I think we should also consider how the knowledge we create in this manner is mobilized and the implications our choice of crime representations might have. So consider the comparison of academic studies. I think that these significant differences in ratings based on crime representation call for some reconsideration about comparing results from studies using different methods of crime representation. Is it still as valid as we'd like to think it is? And then there's the bigger picture. Even though perceptions of crime seriousness are influenced by a perhaps restricted knowledge of crime obtained from the representations of crime we encounter, public perceptions of seriousness play a significant role in how we react to crime. Sentencing and criminal justice policy in multiple countries, including Canada, are based on the presumed seriousness of crime. A seriousness that in some cases is based in part on public perceptions of crime. For example, in Canada, crime severity is measured through the Police Reported Crime Severity Index. This index draws from the more recent 5 years of court sentencing incarceration data and is arguably an objective way of measuring seriousness. However, at the same time, we must not forget that during sentencing, and I think we're all very well aware of this, consideration is always given to the public interest in the case. So to some degree, public perceptions of crime still influence sentencing. And then there is also research done by the Department of Justice showing that police discretion towards young offenders is impacted by police perceptions of the seriousness of the offense. So as demonstrated, the choice of crime representation does influence academic research results. And academic research is recognized as a dependable source of knowledge. And the results from such research might also influence and determine the creation of crime control policies and laws. They might determine which programs and policies receive priority, and they may determine which programs get funding. To put it short, the knowledge we generate in academic research, such as this, can and does have a significant impact on our social responses to crime. I find that this highlights the importance of reflexivity in academic research. When we conduct research on social issues, such as crime and perceptions of crime, and employ representations of crime, it's not as simple as simply asking someone to rate the severity of an assault or a break-and-enter or a fraud. When we conduct and design research involving representations of crime, we paint a picture and we create knowledge. And I think it is essential to carefully consider how we created this knowledge and how this knowledge may be mobilized within and beyond our academic circles. And I think that's it for now.
Thank you so much, Jantje. That was really interesting and also methodologically really interesting. So thank you for your presentation. And we have about close to 20 minutes left for questions. So I'll just get started, and I'll start with the questions in the chat. We have one here by Dr. Combe to Dawn and Sarah. And Dr. Combe is asking, in some national contexts, prisoner transport has been contracted out to private security companies. Have you looked at this at all? And has privatization ever been discussed or used in Canada?
I can take a stab at that. I think that's definitely an issue. From my understanding, in Canada at the federal level, it's done by CSC employees. I'm not sure if Dawn can correct me. I think in other jurisdictions, for sure, you know, I've spent some time working in the UK, particularly in immigration detention, and that was contracted out to different private security companies. I'm not sure, Dawn, if you know about Canada.
Yeah, there, as far as I know, there aren't any private security companies that are being used in Canada. But where we're seeing things messy is that sometimes it can be an employee of the correction, either CSC or the Provincial Correctional Service. Sometimes it can be a police officer. Sometimes it can be a bailiff. So there is also this murkiness in terms of who ultimately is responsible for these forms of transportation. And because the responsibility spread across so many different criminal justice authorities, in the case law, what happens is it's very difficult to establish who has what kind of fiduciary responsibility to who. So, for example, there's one case that Sarah dug up in the case law recently where there was an allegation of neglect and violence on the part of Toronto police officers who were transporting somebody between one Toronto detention center and another. And the argument made from Toronto Police Service was, well, Toronto police officers don't actually have a responsibility to care for or protect prisoners because prisoners are under the jurisdiction of the Ontario Ministry of Correctional Services, and the correctional services that deal with, not police. So there's a kind of secondary shell game in terms of responsibility that is enabled by the fact that so many different kinds of state authority can be involved in these transports.
I would just add that I think the issue of privatization, maybe not necessarily in Canada, but maybe thinking more broadly, I think speaks to or kind of underscores some of the contributions of carceral geographers around the webs or circuits of the carceral state and different actors and players involved at different levels. So again, I think trying to get beyond the kind of institutional focus of prisons or detention centers or police custody as sort of separate, but really part of this interconnected web that characterizes the carceral landscape. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. We have another question here in the chat by Marcela Cassiano, and it's also for Sarah and Dawn. I'm coming from the perspective that conditions of incarceration reflect conditions of employment of the people who care for prisoners. Did you have the chance to observe if and how transporting prisoners in that van affects officers?
Do you want me to take that one, Sarah?
Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you so much for the question. That's a great question. Our research, we didn't include correctional officers in our research. I know there's other folks in the room who have working with correctional officers, and they might be better equipped to answer that part of it. What I can speak to is how the role of correctional officers and their experiences on the vans was perceived by prisoners. And what they perceived was that this was kind of, I want to be too glib about it, but that officers, either correctional officers or police officers or sheriffs who were transporting people, kind of treated this as like it was recess. Right, so I'm not at the institution, not at the office, my boss isn't watching. So if I want to spend an hour listening to the radio and eating a cheeseburger in the en route parking lot and not caring about the conditions of the person who's in the back of my van, even though it's a 30-degree day, then I'll do that. Right, so there was just this kind of sense that there was actually a total lack of surveillance and accountability, which is why this kind of thing is so important to the work that we're doing at the Prison Transparency Project. Because it was almost like a carnival. The way the prisoners described it was that their time on the van for them was torture. And for the people who were transporting them, it was like they got the day off school, could do whatever they wanted. And that was a big part of the reason why these transports that were only supposed to take a half hour to 45 minutes could take many, many, many hours. We even had prisoners talk to us about sort of joy rides that the guards would take, so that they would drive just from one town to the next, just for the hell of it, so that they could stretch out their time out of the institution as much as possible. So I guess also in a way we could think about, from the correctional officer's point of view, that this is also an escape from carcerality for them too, right? And the fact that they treat this as free time, as liberated time, also suggests, and I think shores up our argument, that this is not recognized as a carceral experience, right? If the people who are driving the van see this as their moment of freedom, then not registering at a moment of profound suffering and incarceration for the folks who are in the back, if that makes sense.
If I could just add, my knowledge of the current literature is focused on prisoners' experiences of transport. I haven't seen any literature that looks at it from the perspective of prison officers or escorts, but I think that would be a really interesting topic to look at. Thank you.
Yeah, that would be a super interesting topic to look at. Thank you for the question, Marcel, and thanks for your response, Sarah and Don. We have one question by Dari in the Q&A. It's for Kat and Sophie. What are some of your recommendations pertaining to your research?
Great question. So first of all, building affordable housing, period, full stop. Building affordable housing is really the biggest solution to these really like carceral circumstances that unhoused people are facing in tent cities. And in Kingston, anyway, when the tent city was established, people were much happier living in the tent city in comparison to city provided housing options, because there was nothing permanent. They would be there for a couple weeks, a couple months, and then they would have to leave again. And so people were much happier living in a stable, functioning community in Bell Park than they would be if they had to move to a place where they weren't able to stay permanently. So building affordable housing, listening to unhoused people, listening to their needs is the next recommendation. And then making sort of a mental switch between care and risk management. So public health and carcerality, they share a lot in common, and one of them is risk management discourses. And so making that mental switch to providing care instead of managing risks is huge.
Mm-hmm. And I would add that, you know, Kingston was unique and different from Vancouver in that sense, where they were providing some of those essential services to the encampment. They were providing electricity and garbage pickup, and they stopped that. So For the people that want to refuse the SROs and other types of affordable housing that are provided by the state, we need those types of services, right? If they can socially distance, physically distance properly, and they have these essential services and they prefer to stay in the encampment, that needs to be an option. And I think, you know, we were looking at this in the context of the pandemic. And so obviously these citizens, unhoused citizens, should have been prioritized in the first phase of the vaccine rollout, which of course they really haven't been. So that's another thing that I would add to that. I don't know if Kat has anything she wants to join into. Not to put you on the spot, Kat, but.
No, it's okay. It's okay. I had sort of one more thing to add. You know, some form of either a universal income or increases in social assistance, because, you know, what's happening, at least in Vancouver, is now people that are living in the single room occupant hotels, which, I mean, you know, people don't want to live in there because they're in deplorable condition, but there are people still living there, you know, they're being priced out of those rooms, right? Because now they are becoming too expensive. So yeah, so increases in social assistance so that it's, you know, people can actually afford to rent. And I mean, recommendations are far and wide in terms of economic recommendations and sort of limiting foreign investments and all that kind of stuff. So, I mean, we can sort of probably go forever, but there was a really great report by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives in 2016 that kind of provides, from like a very economic perspective, alternatives, and I can share that in the chat. So
Thank you. We have about 8 more minutes for questions, so keep posting your questions in the chat or Q&A, everyone. I have a question for Jantje. So I'm wondering if you were to add a more qualitative component to your research, what might that look like in engaging with students?
I think if I would try to create this into a qualitative study, I think one of the first things I would do is look at whether there are other ways people, other things people grasp on apart from moral wrongfulness and harmfulness that might guide perceptions of crime. So is there something in the way we depict crime that might trigger something? So far, research has shown that wrongfulness and harmfulness are the main key predictors of crime severity, but I think it would be interesting to see if there's anything else out there and what's really pushing these changes, like what's triggering that difference apart from that then.
Interesting, thank you. There's actually another question for you, Jantje, by Dr. Combe. I think it's an important observation that the research process itself contributes to the social construction of the crime problem. However, do you think the selection of research topic, street crime versus white collar, for example, is more important overall to the social construction of crime and public perceptions than the way crime is operationalized in the research?
They run that question by me again. I didn't quite catch that.
It is also it's also in the chat, but I'll read it out one more time because it's a long question. So it's an important observation that the research process itself contributes to the social construction of the crime problem. However, do you think the selection of research topic, so for example, street crime versus white collar crime, is more important overall to the social construction of crime and public perceptions than the way crime is operationalized in the research?
I think, okay, if I understand what Dr. Combe is getting at, I think it's definitely important to look at the differences in perception if you're comparing street crime versus white collar crime, which I think that's what Dr. Combe's getting at, if I'm correct. I definitely think that perhaps considering the big difference in the way how street crimes and white collar crimes are there's a difference in the way how they get addressed and the way how they get represented in the media. Yeah, I would say that would probably be more important, but at the same time, I think we should also keep in the back of our minds the implication, like the effects, the representation, the way how you represent that crime in actual academic research might have. It's maybe not a big difference, but it's there, right? And I just think it makes research more valid if we just entertain with that idea that our representation of crime does impact those results as well. I hope that answers this question.
Says thanks, and we're also seeing a bunch of really interesting links in the chat. I don't see any other questions at this point, but I will wait just for a little while.